10th May 2022, 12:40 p.m. at locale. Good day to anyone who may encounter this. And this is, following will be a literary analysis and discussion on description of Divine Comedy by Dante Alighieri. This is not scripted, this is the process of scripting. So it will be a study, a literary analysis of Divine Comedy. Study done live on unfamiliar text, some familiar but limitedly reviewed perspective, and discussion had about it ongoingly. Now this is by no means a streamlined process or video. Much time will be spent working through descriptions and understandings of each section. As we go along. So timing of this can be lengthy, but at the end of it we should have crafted a intelligible analysis, intelligible and informative analysis of the work stated. Once more, this will be a study and literary analysis of Inferno of the Divine Comedy by Dante Alighieri, translated by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. First stanza reads, midway upon the journey of our life, I found myself within a forest dark, but the straightforward pathway had been lost. Now, with an introduction, there's two relevant ways that come to mind to interpret the word midway upon a journey of our life. It's likely a statement of context of the age and the season in which the writer or speaker primary speaker introducing writer, likely introducing protagonist, will be positioning themselves within context for the reader, as well as self-description, as well as a level of self-description as to the challenge, as to the status of challenge they may be facing. And by interpreting for the interpretation it also is relevant to note some of the historic context of midway of our life, so it can be used as an indication of the actual person's age when considering historical context, rather than just the tasks they might ascribe of themselves within their lifetime. So, in the context of age, I would be assuming the writer is writing from the perspective of describing themselves in this position, in this initial position of the text, as being just on completion of young adulthood, or completion of, or nearing a first season, or nearing the end of a first period of courtship or marriage, or the early portions of a marriage. Placing in context by age. For in times gone by, life was more fixed and finite, in that persons naturally went through a cycle of birth, youth within a household, a season of for the literates and the studies and the studious, a season of education which may last a few years, a potential further study and occupation within professional capacity under the taskment of a relevant employer or lordship, in like depending on context. And by the end, this period of education would typically start from specialized training education, or early stages of profession, last between the mid-teens to the early 20s. Sort of been time period in which most people would make themselves toward their entry into through their early stages of professional capacity and caliber, would see themselves. And those who are dedicated professional academic pursuit oftentimes may consider themselves entering a mid-stage in their life by position of early development through the entry into their profession and gaining position of taskmanship, in which their station is now supervisory or managerial or oversighting, akin to a stewardship to a lordship, in which they may taskings may be akin to managing the affairs or accounts of an entire town. Something along those lines, depending on skill, adeptness, or similar. They would be holding professional craft within private practice. Even so, they would have likely been ascribed a position of oversight, as is the naturalistic responsibility of those who are learned within communities. They are simply functional representatives, or not way limited. And so, historically, the indication of midway through the journey of our life may also be referred to as with context, to having gone through an early phase of courtship with a suitor after some time within professional capacity, or within adultly responsibility, or an early portion of a marriage, and maybe an early period. It may be at which time they may have raised children out of their earliest years into their pre-adolescence. So all's while assuming they have prior undergone significant taskings and adult responsibilities, or occupational holding, or craftsperson pursuit. I say all this with relevance to note that the character's perspective as an initial, at a stage in a midway of a life, for a person who is upholden to a high standard of societal occupational responsibility within their adult life, is a unique transitional period in which their occupational standing and oversight becomes, as in these ages oftentimes encompasses much to most of all the persons that they may be interacting with or within their towns or communities. They're essentially entering the earliest stages of full autonomy of guide and self-direction in which referenceable intellect and material may start to be limited for their individual contexting and application. In a phasing of early stewardship, in a phasing of early lord or ladyhood. Much time pass This would also indicate a time period in which the prior generation of leaders amongst them would have been phased out, or in these smaller communities, or in communities outside of large kingdoms, that is. Outside of a large kingdom, large kingdom cities. These individuals can find themselves a mentor to many, or individuals may themselves be found within large kingdoms or cities in which their role as maybe a potential craftsman would be less socially functional, but more advisory, if they themselves are positioned under higher commanding under higher imperial command or higher stationed command. But with the transitional route, depending if they themselves will be positioned by higher stationed command. And they may see that themselves. They themselves may ascend to the highest possible designation by a point of midway on the journey of a life. Meaning there are no occupations they may possibly inhabit higher at a level of qualification for those time periods. They may simply, at the midway point in a life, I'm estimating to give an age, and based on the things I've said, I'd say about late 20s to mid 30s. Possibly have children, eldest 7 or 8. Maybe 10 or 12. 15. Similarly, late 20s to mid 30s. I would shine. Persons may have reasonably achieved or found themselves in a position of responsibility where they have the say of oversight, the say of command of the affairs of their institution or organization, as well as the guide and management of subordinate. Scribings of, and of that I'll go back into the description of potential state mindset of the birth, likely potentially held at the time, and that at such an age and position you would be seeing your mentors and prior occupants of position exiting their posts, retiring, or passing on as well. You'd be seeing yourself amongst a tiny few who would be designate of the responsibilities at level within a town, within a township or city, the time period in which this was written. And you'd also be seeing a partner, and if for a man they would also be witnessing transition away from the early stages of companionship with their partner, where their role together would often be focused on the child rearing, to the early phase of period of later childbearing, of fourth or fifth or sixth child, or relaxing and settlement of their family as it may exist, whilst seeing the children move away from that age where they would need mother and fathers, both parents, entire and complete timely attentiveness for their care, and seeing them to an age where they themselves would be transitioning into their phase of academia, or into their early careers themselves, introductory career themselves. This is a period of time where the weight of responsibility and transition upon oneself is very different from what life had been otherwise. An individual sent from early childhood into adulthood through a marriage and a romance, and to the years of raising children, and being mentored to the position where your children are no longer of need. Your partner is no longer of the same is no longer of requiring of the same cooperative necessity for shared tasks, and requirements of shared tasks, and the quantities of shared tasks they may have would be reduced, as well as losing some of the connection to the prior generation of mentored or position holders that would have been most senior in their teaching designation, meaning that a person in their 30s primarily manages and oversees those in their tens to teens and childhood. And by the time those tens to teens reach their 30s, that person in their 30s is approaching the end of their life. So those generation that are likely most closely held as mentor, or may often be most closely held as the high senior mentor they would interact with, that would have been regularly interactable, would be leaving life or in their later life, and their overseeing generation in their 40s would have been managing all the overarching adult affairs. 40s and 50s would be well-aged and nearing, and well-aged and likely also have left life, have been left to pass. So at a major mid-30s, one would see themselves, or in a position, or 30s, early to mid-30s, or position in authority. In that time period, one may see themselves in a position where the initial ideas of life and responsibilities of adult, and the initial ideas of adult life being the primary consideration to the things persons would have looked forward to at the time, being a romantic matrimony and acquisition of occupational status and influence, would have reached what is seen as the early stage of their peak designation, or the early stage of their peak, of their season of peak, a season of pinnacled station, without in which they no longer have to climb for positions or seek to further advance their position, but just maintain the function of the position they are at the time stationed, and the changing of the nature of the romance and matrimonial pairing that happens upon the leaving of children for their own seasons. The tasks at the time the tasks regarding responsibilities at the time may often be deeply trying and personal, regarding the imperative to contribute positively to the lives of the next generation they are overseeing for, as well as to improve on the station tasking of their prior generation. Whilst upholding what would be seen as the standards of presence at the time, the communal designation of task, the communal designations of cultured societal understanding, cultured existential understanding, as well as to build upon such conceptualization for one's own self-direction into higher occupation, as moving into phase of later mentorship. Now I use the term communal cultured societal understanding because each society would have had each society and township would have had its own specific primary histories and giving and goings and workings that are native to it and somewhat specific to it. Within Florentine Italy, or Italy primarily, it was very Catholic as a general, but Florentine time, but in the cities such as Florence, nearing in post-Renaissance era, there would have been considerable focus amongst the academics and those tasked with carrying further growth and hope for civilization. To aspire to a higher than prior and before seen understanding of accessible humanity and intellectual offerability, capacity to, more simply stated, they oftentimes see themselves aspiring to task and position that was larger than what prior generations had conceptualized as being reasonably human. They'd also be seeing themselves in a place where persons aspiring and working towards these would be comparatively comparatively more densely located than all the neighboring surroundings outside the primary city. And they would themselves note that those who are working towards such taskings would be few, but they would understand such imperative as they would understand or see themselves as tasked great imperative to uphold and contribute in such a manner. Because especially noting the difference in the contrast they may see of themselves within the illiterate few and finite within their tasking and responsibility toward upliftment of the wider population that surrounds. Few as literate, some capable of, few highly literate, few to some could read. The many, the 90 could not. And in pursuit of the literature of the most influential literatures you would have seen at the time, there would be enormous pressure to contribute to their communal growth, their moral development, their intellectual offerance, their directive on personal and individual peace, their guide away from the ills and worse and harsher trials and misfortunes of a life, and the imperative to instill, the imperative to offer perspective that could be held onto the existential challenges of living amongst each other, as well as perspective offered on the stark contrast in challenge, the stark contrast in tasking and designation between achieving or working towards such high academic proficiency, especially given the limited accessibility, and the contention with a life, the contention with self-stationing without such literacy. Stanza 1. Stanza 2. Midway upon the journey of our life, I found myself within a dark forest, for the straightforward pathway had been lost. Ah me, how hard a thing it is to say. What was this forest, savage, rough, and stern, which in the very thought renews the fear? So bitter it is, death is little more, but of the good to treat, which there I found. essential within the very thought that renews the fear. Stanza 2 is mostly a notance of the challenge, direct notance of summary of the challenge, whilst specifically qualifying the task, likely specifically referencing the tasking of station, as well as the existential transition and viewership of life rapidly passing, whilst getting into a mid-task season. Life expectancy being 50s to 60s, primarily 50s. A lot of sight of death in the conventional ways of disease and old age, primarily disease, as well as much requirement to guide and support those who themselves be more closely being affected by deaths within their community, or deaths of their loved ones, as well as seeing the several as well as being the remaining higher support after for the young ones, 15s to 20s, would oftentimes be seeing their parents' passings. 15s to early 20s would oftentimes be seeing their parents' passings, just nearing hope, either within their early occupation or nearing their early phase of marriage, early rearing of children. So bitter it is, death is little more. Calmly stated a description of the task. So bitter it is. Acknowledgement, somber, but cool-headed, given the clarity of the me within prior stanza, and further followed by the death is little more, which then is to state a simultaneous reassurance, continued awareness of presence, and overbearingness on the right of himself, yet stancing posturing and consolidation towards confidence and stoic resolve within the face of its task and reality, such as of the greater responsibility to be had by their seeing, simultaneously reiterating the counsel, simultaneously elaborating on the reality, whilst offering an illustration of a position of reassurance, immediately followed by the necessity to understand that in a position of reassurability, in a position where that for those who may occupy a position of reassurability or mentorship, they would also have to uphold their responsibility to instill and carry forth that awareness. And simultaneously staying within offerance of console, even those who amongst their standing by a prior illustration, a previous stanza, calmly phraseable strong terms, savage, rough and stern, gradual decrease, and the intro of the me. The harder thing it is to say what a task they have, what a task is had, the actment and the carryment of the duty of support and responsiveness, which in the very thought renews the fear amongst themselves and of others, yet necessitating description. Clear and purely emphasizing the tonal note, the tonal notance of calm in face of the idea of discussion, an idea of confronting, as illustrated between stanza 2 and 3, as evident by the me, how hard are things to say. And the confirmation, if unrecognized up until that point, but of good to treat, which there I found. Speak will I, the other things I saw there. To comment on that, based in addition to what has already been said, it's a lot of, the speaker seems to be placing a lot of emphasis at death, or revealing immediately that death is a major aspect of emphasis, and the reality of a mortal existence, and an existential perspective through the viewership of mortality as their primary shaping factor and primary guiding influence in the text. Whilst further noting that whilst introducing the text from the line, speak will I of the other things I saw there, while simultaneously confirming that the things they are going to talk about are going to be within reference to the central theme of the address of mortality, and also functional for the reassurance and guide unto others as to how they can treat for it. Simply meaning, caring for it, one may not find the most easy path in confronting it itself, but rather speaking of the life surrounding the aspects of a mortality that may be experienced. Describing their effects, describing their natures, describing the convictions that go into them, describing their sighted understanding within prior, negotiating and confronting with the convictions had, negotiating and confronting with the gentle, immortal nature that one would approach within, and illustrating the relation of the tasking they would have to endure, furthered by discussion on specifics of how they themselves might see a path to peaceful and light through the relevant aspects of the death, life, mortal and viewership of existence in context, grander and simpler within that regard. As well as or towards a supportive function, a guide towards a guide towards furtherance of individual enduring and illustration of higher moral aspect of the Holdens of higher moral aspect of how one can be, of one would might aspire to Holdens of higher moral aspect, self-Holdens to higher moral aspect. And a walk, an offerance of path through an individual journey in context of the mortality understood. Guided by the nature, primarily, as to restate, primarily guided by the understood natures and the higher morality perceived, the highest moralities perceived, or artisanry and humanity of those at position or path. Page 1. I was speaking consistently for 47 minutes. New concept on page 2.